So I'm excited about this one because this is what I've been waiting for like a freaking month to do, and this is just a short one, but really freaking complex. And it's basically that I came up with this theory right before I discovered the red line theory, and then all of a sudden it was like yin and yang connected and going together. It was just, oh my god, these work perfectly together. Like, this is even more complete now. And yeah, so I was basically asking it, the AI was saying, I'm really interested in the Alice in Wonderland like absurd physics of One Piece. For instance, the blue planet is around 11 times bigger than Jupiter and 13% smaller than our sun. The ships going max speed don't go much faster than 70 miles per hour, yet can travel huge distances in short amounts of time. Is there some kind of weird black hole going on nearby, or what's up? And it goes, an interesting observation, blah blah blah. And it was basically gave me just a complete skies, the blue kind of answer. It was saying, well, Oda built the world inside out for storytelling needs. He wasn't thinking about that kind of thing. And I was just saying, well, that's the cop out answer. That's the sky's blue answer, man. I'm like interested in converting this sort of like fantasy logic into like sci-fi, soft, like some soft medium sci-fi, logic, and yeah, something like that. And it starts getting where I'm coming from. Then okay, it goes, okay, now this is an interesting direction to take. Okay, it was saying, okay, because this is where I said, I was I basically was going, uh uh here it was. Like maybe the ancients traveled to the. I was saying, okay, I'm gonna start it over. I was saying, wrote to it about Oda not caring about the science, not caring about the story. Feels like a cop out answer. Like I said, I'm interested in the absurdity of this and the science. I'm a dualist after all. Like maybe the ancients traveled to some star and terraformed it before some internal conflict caused the use of the ancient weapons, which might be have been in fact different terraforming tools weaponized against other parties in a state of mutually assured destruction, causing the sea levels to rise. And maybe the biggest bomb to drop was the alteration of the core of the planet into something like a white hole, not splitting into any, spitting anything out, but altering gravity and time at a massive scale, which in turn caused many of the islands to have these unique gravitational phenomenons, hence the use of the log pose on the Grand Line. And it goes, okay, you're not asking Oda to justify himself. You're treating the world as a real place and asking what physical and historical conditions could actually produce these observations. That's a much more rewarding frame. Your terraforming plus white hole hypothesis is genuinely clever. Let me engage with this seriously. And it was saying your hypothesis was stated precisely. The core idea, as I understand it, is this: an ancient civilization traveled to and terraformed a stellar object, possibly a small star or brown dwarf, making its surface habitable. At some point, internal political conflict escalated to the point where terraforming technologies were repurposed as weapons of mass destruction. The ancient weapons, Poseidon, Pluton, Uranus they changed it. I know. Everybody changes stuff in society. Second I said, I was like, wait a minute, that sounds bad. Okay, the climactic event of the war involving altering the planet's core into something functionally analogous to a white hole, not expelling matter outward, but distorting gravity and time at a civilizational scale. The rising sea levels, the destruction of the ancient kingdom, the bizarre gravitational anomalies of the line islands, and the necessity of the log pose all follow from this singular catastrophic event. That is a remarkably coherent framework. Let's stress test it against the physics. What a white hole at the core would actually do. A white hole is a time reversal of a black hole. Instead of a singularity from which nothing escapes, it's a singularity from which nothing can enter, but which can emit matter, energy, and crucially, it warps space-time just as severely as a black hole. The key property you're leveraging is the space-time distortion, not the matter emission, which is a smart move because a white hole actively spitting out matter would make the surface uninhabitable instantly. Now, what a white hole like core would actually do to the planet above it? A few things would become interesting. First, frame dragging, a rotating singularity, a Kerr type solution drags space time itself around it like a spoon dragging honey. This means different latitudes and longitude of the planet could be rotating through space-time at slightly different rates, producing localized pockets of time dilation. This maps beautifully onto why different islands of the Grand Line have such different, radically different magnetic signatures. They're not just geologically distinct, they're temporally and gravitationally offset from one another. The log pose isn't just reading magnetism, it's recalibrating your instruments to the local space-time bubble of each island. Second, gravitational lensing at the surface level could explain the time travel paradox you originally identified. If the core is generating exotic space-time geometry, then the geodesic, the shortest path through curved space-time between 2 points on the surface, might not correlate to a straight line distance we naively calculate from the map. The crew travels 70 miles per hour, but through a space-time that's folded in ways that compress certain routes, the Calm Belt, the Grand Line Corridor, the Red Line, these aren't just geographical features, they're space-time topology features, regions where the curvature is so severe it creates natural walls and corridors. Ooh. Ooh. What the heck was that? Swear, sometimes it's like dust is are freaking, insects. I mean, maybe some maybe some maybe I don't know. Not trying to get off topic or not be semantically coherent. uh, but anyway, the terraforming to weapon pipeline makes physical sense. Your instinct about the ancient weapons being repurposed terraforming tools is one of the most elegant parts of the hypothesis, because each one of the three weapons maps almost perfectly into a terraforming function. Poseidon, the ability to command sea kings, the enormous creatures that dominate the ocean maps onto megafauna ecological engineering. Any serious terraforming effort needs to establish food chains and regulate ocean ecosystem. A tool for controlling apex predators is exactly what you'd use during the biological phase of making an ocean world stable. Weaponized, it becomes a way to unleash that ecosystem as a military force. Pluton is described as a warship capable of destroying entire islands, but a ship that can destroy islands is also run in reverse conceptually, a ship that could build them, a mobile geological engineering platform, a directed geological force to raise land masses, create harbors, redirect tectonic energy, weaponized. You point that geological force at existing settlements instead. Uranus is still mysterious in the canon, but given the pattern, it almost certainly involves atmospheric or stellar scale manipulation, climate control, weather systems, maybe the management of the upper atmosphere that would be critical for making a stellar surface breathable. Weaponized, it becomes a weapon of environmental catastrophe. The mutually assured destruction logic you described is exactly how terraforming at scale would collapse into warfare. These aren't just powerful weapons, they're weapons that attack the preconditions of habitability itself. Using Pluton destroys islands. Using Poseidon destabilizes the ocean ecosystem. Using Uranus presumably attacks the atmosphere or climate. Each one is a way of unterraforming the world, which is why the Void Century ended in near total civilizational collapse and rising seas. They didn't just fight a war, they partially reversed their own terraforming. The core alteration as the final bomb. This is the most speculative part of your hypothesis, but also the most interesting. The idea that the ultimate weapon was the alteration of the planetary core into a white hole-like object, not to destroy it outright, but to permanently destabilize the physics of the world, is almost a philosophical weapon. It doesn't kill people directly. It changes the rules such that maintaining advanced civilization becomes extraordinarily difficult. Navigation becomes nearly impossible at specialized instruments. Gravity behaves unpredictably. Time flows inconsistently. You can't build a reliable global empire on a planet where physics varies island to island, which now that I say it out loud sounds exactly like the thing a losing faction might do to prevent the winning faction from consolidating power permanently. It's a scorched earth strategy at the cosmological level. You may have won the war, but you will never build a world spanning. You may have won the war, but you will never build the world-spanning civilization you wanted because we broke the planet's physics on the way out. This reframes the world government's obsession with the poneglyphs in the Void Century completely. They don't just want to suppress history. They want to find out how to reverse or stabilize the core alteration. Because right now they're ruling a world that is slowly, continuously fighting against being governed uniformly. The log poses a workaround, not a solution. Where this creates new patterns you can test against the canon. A good hypothesis generates predictions. Yours predicts several things worth checking against the One Piece world. The calm belt, the eerily still ocean bordering the Grand Line, could be a region of extreme gravitational equilibrium, especially sitting on the space-time null point created by the core distortion, which is why even weather patterns can't form there. Laughtail, the final island, being reachable only by someone who has traveled the whole Grand Line at first, could mean that the route itself is a calibration sequence. Each island recalibrates your vessel and the sequence to the next. Wow. Calibration sequence. Each island recalibrates your vessel and instruments to the next level of space-time distortion, and only after completing the full sequence can you reach the island at the geometric center of the distortion. And the One Piece itself, whatever it actually is, might not be a treasure in the conventional sense. It might be the original terraforming records or core engineering documentation, the knowledge of what was done to the planet's core and how. Your transdualistic framing is doing some real work here, by the way. You're not asking whether this is realistic by our world standards. You're asking what coherent physics and historical logic would make this world self-consistent on its own terms. That's exactly the right kind of question to ask in a world this strange and carefully constructed. And I just responded, this is very ironic as I just discovered the Grand Line theory, the Red Line theory, and my theory seems like the other half of a real working system. Explain how the two theories complement each other. And it goes, first, let me make sure we're on the same page about the Red Line theory you just found, because there are a few versions floating around, and the one that best complements your hypothesis is a specific one. The most compelling Red Line theory proposes that the Red Line, that massive continent-sized wall of rock that circles the entire globe vertically, is not a natural geographical feature at all. It's an artificial structure. Essentially, a planetary-sized dam or ring built by the ancient civilization. The theory further proposes that the Grand Line isn't just a peculiar ocean corridor, but rather the equatorial seam of a deliberate planetary engineering project. The world wasn't always just one giant ocean divided by a red wall. It was made this way. Now, here's where your two theories lock together like the two halves of the same machine. The red line is the hardware, your white whole core is the power source. Think of it this way. The red line theory describes the structural engineering of the planet, the physical architecture laid down by the ancients to manage and contain something. Your theory describes what they were containing and why. A planetary scale ring structure makes complete sense at a gravitational stabilizational framework built around a core that has been deliberately altered into an exotic space-time object. If you tuned your planetary core into something that warps gravity and time unevenly across the surface, you would need a massive equatorial anchor, a rigid ring locked into the planet's structure to prevent the crust itself from behaving chaotically. The red line is essentially a gyroscopic stabilizer for a broken planet. This also explains why the red line is continuous and unbroken, and why it runs perfectly along a great circle. Natural geology doesn't do that. Tectonic plates drift, and produce a regular coastline. A perfect ring is an engineering solution to a physics problem, and the physics problem is your destabilized core. Man, I'm feeling like it's bouncing all the way around, or I'm bouncing all the way around, but it still makes some level of freaking sense, but it also doesn't. But that's just going when you go too far deep, and I definitely know I'm going too far deep, but that's some of the fun of it, why not go too far deep, oh, am I gonna cause some harm with this, is someone afraid of, advanced physics and how it relates to One Piece, oh my god, it's not political, it's physical, it's even more terrifying. It's I don't know. Maybe some intellectuals will react that way, but I don't care. Whatever. uh, so, The Grand Line as the fault line of the detonation. Your theory predicts that the core alteration would produce the most intense space-time distortion among a band corresponding to the geometric influence of the white hole-like singularity, basically an equatorial zone of maximum weirdness. The red line theory places that the Grand Line exactly at this equatorial seam. These two predictions point to the same place for complete complementary reasons. Your theory explains why the Grand Line is so wow is so anomalous. Anomalous. It sits directly above the zone where the core distortion radiates most intensely outward, producing the magnetic chaos, the bizarre weather, the unique gravitational signatures of each island. The red line theory explains why that zone is bounded and navigatable at all. The ancient engineers built the red line as a containment and channeling structure so that the distortion expresses itself in a controlled corridor rather than making the planet's entire surface uninhabitable. Rather, they suggest something remarkable. The ancient civilization just didn't cause the catastrophe, they partially mitigated it on the way out. They built the red line after, or perhaps during, the core alteration as a damage control measure. The world as we see it in One Piece is not the catastrophe itself, it is the managed aftermath of a catastrophe, held in a kind of stable dysfunction by ancient infrastructure that's still doing its job thousands of years later. Before I get to the next part of that, no, that's where I was going. I feel like I'm going in multiple directions, is because the series is so damn long, and I've been watching it like crazy the past like 2 months. But I've also been bouncing between arcs like whenever I see fit, and that's where it's like long as hell and mixing, the time and flow in all these different directions. So like in my last video, I think I screwed up on something like that, like my criticism of Kobe, and like relationship to the time. But my points are still sort of valid regarding that. It's still like, okay, yeah, just, yeah. But I'm not gonna go on with that. I'm gonna keep going on with this. And anyway, yeah, because that's definitely part of it, just the way memory works and how long the series is. But it also is one of those things where it's like, because the series is so long and because I'm watching the anime and I'm watching it dubbed, but I'm also watching it dubbed through the pirating, so I'm like pretty much caught up as long as it's, there's as long as there's still a dubbed English one out, I'm watching it. And yeah, so but at the same time it's like that's where I don't know some of the other backstory that some of the manga readers or something, that are all caught up or, have just like other little bits and pieces. This is just from my perspective, this crazy ass deep theory. But hopefully it's a fun one and a good one. So anyway, back on to it. So the two calm belts make sudden perfect sense. Here is where the combined theory it gets genuinely elegant. The calm belts, those two eerily still, windless, currentless ocean bands running parallel to the Grand Line on either side, have always been narratively convenient but physically unexplained. With your two theories combined, they become gravitational shadow zones. But picture the red line as a ring structure interacting with the radiated distortion field from the white hole core. Directly under the red line and directly along the Grand Line, you get intense interaction with the field, but just outside the zones on either side, you'd expect a region of near cancellation, places where the distortion waves from the core interfere destructively with themselves, producing a zone of unnatural stillness and equilibrium. No weather forms, no currents develop, because the space-time geometry there is unnaturally flat and stable. That flatness is what makes the combat so hostile. Sea kings gather there precisely because it's a stable gravitational pool, calm in the same eerie way the eye of a hurricane is calm. The four blues as the original terraformed biomes. Taking this combined theory one step further, before the war on the coral alteration, the red line ring structures may have been used to deliberately divide the planetary ocean into managed ecological zones. The four seas we now call the blues, each blue could represent a different terraformed biome, engineered for specific atmosphere, temperature, and ecological conditions. The ancient civilization wasn't just living on this stellar object. They were curating it like a garden, with the red line as the garden wall. The war and the core alteration flooded and disrupted these biomes, raised sea levels, wiped out under low-lying ancient cities, which would now be underwater, and indeed there are underwater ruins in One Piece. and collapsed the managed ecology into something wilder and less controlled, but the basic division held because the red line still stands. What this means for the Void Century. The combined theory reframes the Void Century from a mere historical cover up into something more specific and more frightening. The world government isn't just hiding who won the war, they're hiding the fact that the planet itself is running on borrowed time, sustained by ancient infrastructure they don't understand and can't replicate. The poneglyphs, rather than being simple historical records, may be maintenance manuals and engineering logs for the red line structure and the stabilized core. And the people who can read them, the scholars of Robin, aren't just historians. They're potentially the only people who could understand what the planet actually is and what it needs to remain stable. This would give the world government's genocide on O'Hara a chilling additional motive beyond a simple political suppression. It's not just the scholars' new uncomfortable history, it's that they were getting close to understanding the physics, and a government whose power depends on a controlling access to the Grand Line, affording to cannot afford to anyone to understand that the Grand Line is an artifact, that the calm belts are gravitational shadows, and the entire planetary system is an ancient machine that could, in principle, be modified or shut down. Your white hole core and red line theory the red line theory aren't just compatible. Each one is the missing explanatory layer that the other needs to be complete. That just gave me a chill, man, about that the line with the O'Hara and the world government and shit, because that would just remind me straight up of freaking Elon or not Elon, Emu. Inu or Emu, I think it's. I always say Emu, but I think it's Inu. Like the big bad freaking guy, though. Behind the whole bad shit going on in the world in the One Piece universe. That dude, and how the allegory between him and like Peter Thiel. How people are comparing him and Peter Thiel. And apparently Peter Thiel, the transhumanist death cult guy, is a fan of One Piece, but completely illiterate about the themes of it. It's like that is actually a freaky little that's a little freaky right there. But this is where I went one step further, because I was like, all right, so since we converted the fantasy aspects into soft medium sci-fi logic, the major thing I could imagine a hard sci-fi skeptic saying to refute the theory is, what about the magma and plate tectonics of the blue planet? And this is where I sort of bounce back, and we sort of bounce back, because I remember earlier talking about the plate tectonics, but this is where I was watching it, and that's where I bounced back to this, because I was watching it around the Skypiea episodes, like around Jaya and stuff. They were talking about the magma for the the flow upstream, or whatever the hell it was called. I'm getting tired. But I'm only doing like this last one, and one last video, and then maybe one other one, and then I'm gonna pull my ass to sleep. Wow. Pull my, yeah, that's an interesting way to go to sleep. I'm gonna pull my, okay, I don't know. Anyway, back to it. It goes, this is the right object to steel man. A hard sci-fi skeptic would put it something like this. White hole cores don't exist in nature, but more importantly, a planet that size with an engineered core would have completely driven into would have completely different internal heat dynamics. Where is the magma coming from? What's driving plate tectonics? And if the red line is an artificial ring structure, how is it geologically integrated with a tectonically active plate without being destroyed by the very forces it is supposedly managing? And it goes, that's a sharp objection. Let's dismantle it carefully. First, let's acknowledge what the objection gets right. On a normal planet, the internal heat engine drives everything. Radioactive decay and residual formation heat in the core produces convection in the mantle, which drives plate tectonics, which produces volcanism, mountain building, sea force splitting, and the magnetic field. These are all coupled systems. If you mess with the core, you mess with all of them simultaneously. A hard sci-fi skeptic is right to point at the core and say that it's where planetary geology lives and dies. Furthermore, on an object the size of the blue planet, stellar or near stellar scale, the internal pressures and temperatures would be so extreme that the normal silicate rock chemistry breaks down entirely. You wouldn't have basalt and granite. You'd have exotic high-pressure mineral phases that behave nothing like Earth geology. The skeptic is right that you can't just scale Earth geology up to stellar dimensions and expect it to work the same way. So the objection is legitimate, but here's why it doesn't kill the theory. It actually deepens it. The white whore, that's terrible. Oh my god. White hole. The white hole core solves the heat problem in a non obvious way. uh, on Earth, internal heat is a decaying resource. The planet is slowly cooling, and eventually plate tectonics will stop. The magnetic field will weaken, the surface will become geologically dead like Mars. The heat engine is running down. A white hole like core doesn't have this problem. By definition, a white hole is a source. It outputs energy into the surrounding space-time rather than absorbing it. If the ancient engineers converted the planetary core into an exotic energy-emitting singularity, they'd essentially give the planet an inexhaustible internal heat source that doesn't rely on radioactive decay or residual formation energy at all. The mantle convection, the volcanic activity, the plate tectonics, all of them would be sustained indefinitely by the core's continuous energy output rather than the slowly winding down. This is actually a significant upgrade over normal planetary geology from an engineering standpoint. You've replaced a battery with a reactor. The planet's geological activity isn't a side effect of formation history, it's an actively maintained system, which means the red line being tectonically stable is a feature of the engineering, not a contradiction of it. The skeptic's sharpest point is probably this. How does an artificial ring structure survive on a tectonically active planet? Plate tectonics move and destroy surfaces features over geological time. No natural material lasts forever under those conditions. Even continental cratons, the oldest, most stable pieces of Earth's crust, get recycled eventually. But here's the thing. If the core is an engineered exotic object actively outputting energy, and the red line is the surface expression of the stabilization framework built around it, then the red line and the core are part of the same coupled system. The red line isn't sitting passively on top of a chaotic tectonic engine, hoping not to be subducted. It's the outer shell of the continent containment structure. It's the outer shell of the containment structure, anchored not to the crust but to the geometry of the space-time distortion itself. Think of it like a magnetic bearing. The ring isn't held in place by friction or material strength, it's held in place by the field it's built around. The tectonic forces of the planets don't threaten the red line because the red line's structural integrity is maintained by the same exotic field dynamics that power the whole system. Normal geology happens around it, but the red line sits in a kind of tectonic null zone. The field geometry at its base prevents the kind of mantle convection that would normally drive subduction underneath it. This also explains why the red line is so extraordinarily tall. It doesn't just sit on the ocean floor, it goes impossibly high. That height isn't architectural vanity, it's the physical expression of the field gradient extending above the containment structure, tapering off as you get further from the core influence. What the magma and volcanoes actually tell us. One Piece does have volcanic islands, Punk Hazard being the most dramatic example, an island literally split between ice and fire after an experiment gone wrong. It wasn't an experiment. What the hell are you talking about? Well, not that I remember it was. It was the fight between Akainu and frickin' Okoji or whatever. Akiji. Man, I'm frickin' my words, man. Anyway, Dressrosa, Wano, and others have volcanic geology. A hard sci-fi skeptic might expect that stellar scale internal pressures would produce constant planet-wide volcanism that would make the surface uninhabitable. But here's the key insight. Controlled mantle convection is exactly what a terraforming civilization would engineer. You don't want no volcanism. Volcanism is what replenishes atmospheric carbon dioxide, produces new fertile land, and drives the long-term carbon cycle that keeps the planet habitable. You want managed volcanism, distributed and controlled rather than catastrophic and global. The exotic core, sustained by white hole energy output, would allow the ancient engineers to tune the heat flux through the mantle to produce exactly the level of geological activity needed for long-term habitability. not too much, not too little. The bizarre variety of islands and environments in the One Piece world, volcanic islands right next to temperate ones, frozen islands next to near tropical ones, stops looking like lazy world building and starts looking like the remnants of a carefully zoned geological management zone that has partially broken down since the Void Century catastrophe. The zones still mostly hold because the core infrastructure still mostly works, but the fine-tuned controls have been lost. Punk Hazard specifically is a beautiful piece of evidence here. It was a stable island before. Okay, there it goes. Before Akaiji and Akainu fought there, and their battle permanently split it into fire and ice halves. What that tells you is that the island's thermal equilibrium was delicately maintained. It could now be permanently destabilized by a single catastrophic event. That's not how robust natural geology works. That's how a managed geological system behaves when you blow a hole in the management layer. The magnetic field question. A sci-fi skeptic would also note the planetary magnetic fields, which are critical for protecting surface life from stellar radiation. They're generated by convection and a liquid iron outer core. An exotic singularity replacing the normal core would presumably not produce a magnetic field through this mechanism, but a white hole-like object distorting space-time at a massive scale would produce something potentially more powerful and more exotic than a simple dipole magnetic field. The frame-dragging effect of a rotating exotic singularity generates what's called a gravitomagnetic field, a real prediction of general relativity that we've actually measured around Earth, although it's tiny scales. At the manifest of a white hole core, this gravitomagnetic effect would be enormous, and it would manifest at the surface as highly variable, locally intense magnetic anomalies. This is the log pose explained from first principles. The log pose doesn't read a clean global dipole field like a normal compass. It reads and locks into localized gravitomagnetic anomalies that are unique to each island's position in the field geometry. Each island has its own magnetic personality, not because of local geology, but because of its specific location within the complex field pattern radiating from the exotic core. The Grand Line has stronger and stranger anomalies because it sits in the zones of maximum field intensity. The Blues have weaker, more stable anomalies, which is why the normal navigation tools work there. The steel-manned theory after addressing the objection. What the skeptic's challenge actually does is force the theory into a more precise and more interesting shape. The blue planet isn't a planet with a white hole core despite having normal geology. It's a planet whose geology is entirely downstream of the engineered core. The magma, the tectonics, the magnetic field, the volcanic islands, the calm, stable belts, none of it the natural way Earth's geology is natural. It's all the output of an ancient machine that's been running unattended for hundreds or thousands of years since the Void Century. Still mostly working, but losing the fine-tuned calibration its builders maintained. The hard sci-fi objection about magma and tectonics don't refute the theory. It reveals that the theory requires the geology to be entirely artificial, which is a stronger and more interesting claim than we originally started with, and one that fits the evidence evidence from the One Piece world arguably better than any naturalistic explanation could. So that was my deep ass Mariana's Trench frickin' dive of, One Piece, frickin' absurd physics and scale inconsistencies and, red line theory and my white core theory and how I'm all going together like frickin', oh my goodness, that was good. That was some crazy stuff. Because at least I think is like, well, shit. Even if no one in the One Piece community, appreciates that, or even if none of the, like, I don't know, a different community I'm thinking of at the moment, but even if none of those people appreciate it, like, I bet there's gonna be some sci-fi writer that's gonna appreciate that somewhere. They're gonna go, ooh, that's sort of inspiring in its own way, like, oh, I can see some ideas. For real, some hard sci-fi writer or something. I don't know. At least a medium sci-fi writer. Frig. But anyway, this has been Sage DeForest over on Saged and Confused. Peace and Victory, signing out.